She was thrown into the pitch-black cell to be eaten alive by the Mad King. The heavy iron door slammed shut, sealing her in with a monster that hadn't spared a single soul in 6 months. She squeezed her eyes shut, waiting for the agony of his claws. But when the massive feral beast lunged from the shadows, its jaws snapping inches from her throat, it didn't tear her apart. Instead, the beast inhaled her scent, dropped its massive head to the cold stone floor, and whimpered. What she didn't know was that her scent was the only cure to a curse that was destroying his mind. And what the pack didn't know was that by throwing the voiceless Omega into the dungeon, they had just handed the Alpha King exactly what he needed to destroy them all. Welcome to the Alpha Claim, where the shadows hold secrets and the wolves who love the hardest never let go. If you are new here, hit that subscribe button right now and turn on the notification bell so you never miss a chapter. And if you love stories where the underdog gets the ultimate revenge, drop the word claimed in the comments below. The night belongs to us. Let's begin. Chapter 1. Silence was the only thing Elara truly owned. She was 21 years old, an Omega servant in the formidable Iron Claw Pack, and she had not spoken a single word since she was 7 years old. The healers called it trauma. The pack called it weakness. In a world governed by roars, growls, and the absolute authority of the Alpha Command, a wolf without a voice was a wolf without a soul. Elara scrubbed the marble floors of the grand dining hall until her knuckles were raw and bleeding. The rough bristles of the brush scraped against the stone, a rhythmic, punishing sound that matched the dull ache in her chest. She kept her head down. She always kept her head down. Invisible. That was how you survived in a pack house that had descended into cruelty. For the past 6 months, the Iron Claw Pack had been rotting from the inside out. Their true leader, Alpha King Thorn, had succumbed to the blood rot, a dark, ancient curse that turned a shifter's own wolf against his human mind. The pack had woken one night to the sounds of slaughter. The king had gone feral, a mindless beast of pure rage. For the safety of the kingdom, he had been chained in the deepest catacombs beneath the castle, left to rot in the dark. In his absence, his Beta Vane had taken the throne as regent. Vane was a cruel, vain man who ruled not with respect, but with fear. And the pack house had become a nightmare. You missed a spot, Mute. Elara froze. She didn't need to look up to know who was standing over her. Greta, the head maid, stepped heavily onto the freshly cleaned marble, leaving a trail of muddy boot prints right over the space Elara had just spent 20 minutes scrubbing. Greta smiled, a nasty, sharp expression that crinkled the corners of her eyes. Elara bit the inside of her cheek, tasting copper. She grabbed her rag and reached forward to wipe away the mud. But as she did, Greta's boots snapped out, kicking the heavy wooden bucket of dirty mop water. The freezing, filthy water splashed across the floor, soaking Elara's thin servant dress to the bone. The icy shock stealing her breath. Clean it up, Greta sneered, and be quick about it. Beta Vane is hosting the regional alphas tonight. If this floor isn't spotless, I'll have the guards whip your back until you finally remember how to scream. Elara kept her eyes on the floor. Her inner wolf, tiny, suppressed, and locked away in the darkest corner of her mind, let out a pathetic whimper. She nodded once, taking the wet rag in her freezing, trembling hands, and began to scrub the stone all over again. Chapter 2. The mistake happened during the evening feast. Elara was carrying a heavy silver tray loaded with roasted venison and dark wine. Her arms shook from exhaustion. She hadn't eaten since yesterday morning. As she approached the head table, where Beta Vane sat draped in the king's furs, laughing loudly at a joke made by a visiting noble, a guard suddenly stepped backward. He bumped directly into Elara. She couldn't shout a warning. The tray tipped. The heavy crystal goblet slid across the polished silver. Elara dropped to her knees, desperately trying to catch it, but she wasn't fast enough. The goblet shattered against the edge of the table, sending a wave of dark, crimson wine directly onto Beta Vane's lap. The entire great hall went dead silent. The music stopped. The laughter evaporated. Vane looked down at his ruined clothes. Then, slowly, he looked down at Elara. She was on her knees among the broken crystal, trembling so violently her teeth rattled. She pressed her hands together, bowing her head to the floor in a desperate, silent plea for mercy. "A ruined tunic," Vane said, his voice dripping with venom. "Disrespect in front of my honored guests." He stood up, towering over her. "You worthless, broken creature." He didn't strike her. That would be too quick. Vane looked at Greta, who was standing pale and terrified near the kitchen doors. "Greta," Vane commanded, a cruel, sickening smile spreading across his face. "The beast in the dungeons has not been fed in 3 days. He must be starving." Elara's blood turned to ice. "No, no." "Take this useless Omega down to the catacombs," Vane ordered, his voice echoing off the vaulted ceilings. "Throw her in the king's cell. Let her be of some use to the pack. Let her be his meal." Panic, blind and absolute, tore through Elara. She scrambled backward, shaking her head frantically. She tried to scream, tried to force her vocal cords to make a sound, but only a dry, broken hiss escaped her lips. 2 massive guards grabbed her by the arms, hauling her off the floor. She kicked, she fought, she dug her heels into the marble, but she was nothing compared to their strength. The pack watched in silence. Some looked away. Most just stared. No one lifted a finger to stop it. They dragged her out of the light of the great hall, down the spiraling stone stairs, deep into the belly of the earth. The air grew colder with every step. The torches on the walls flickered weakly, casting long, monstrous shadows. The smell of damp earth, mildew, and ancient iron filled her lungs. And then she heard it. A roar. It wasn't the sound of a wolf. It was the sound of a demon. A guttural, chest-rattling snarl that vibrated through the stone walls and shook the marrow in Elara's bones. The sound of King Thorn, the feral alpha, the monster in the dark. The guards stopped in front of a massive iron door reinforced with silver chains. They were sweating, their eyes wide with genuine terror. Even the elite warriors feared what was behind that door. One guard unlocked the heavy deadbolt. The other shoved Elara forward. "May the goddess have mercy on you," the guard muttered. The heavy door creaked open, revealing a cavernous, pitch-black cell. They threw her inside. Elara hit the cold stone floor hard, scraping her knees and palms. Before she could even scramble around, the heavy iron door slammed shut behind her. The lock clicked. She was alone in the dark. Chapter 3. For a long moment, there was only the sound of her own ragged, terrified breathing. Elara pressed her back against the freezing iron of the door, her heart hammering against her ribs like a trapped bird. Clink. Drag. The sound of heavy chains moving across stone. Clink. Drag. He was moving. Elara's eyes strained against the darkness. Slowly, 2 points of light appeared in the blackness. Eyes. Burning, unnatural, blood-red eyes. They were fixed directly on her. A low growl started in the darkness. It was a sound of pure, unadulterated madness. The beast was massive. As it stepped into the faint sliver of moonlight filtering through a high grate, Elara saw the outline of a monster. He was in his hybrid form, standing on 2 legs, but covered in thick, matted black fur. claws the length of daggers scraped against the stone. His shoulders were broad enough to block out the light. Heavy iron cuffs were bolted to his wrists and neck, the chains bolted to the floor, but they looked like they could snap at any moment. The Alpha King had lost everything human about him. Saliva dripped from his bared fangs. He dropped to all fours, the muscles in his back coiling like thick ropes preparing to strike. Elara squeezed her eyes shut. She crossed her arms over her chest, curled into a tight ball, and waited for the end. "Let it be fast," she prayed silently to the moon goddess. "Please, just let it be fast." The beast lunged. The force of his movement cracked the stone beneath his paws. The chains pulled taut with a deafening clang. He was right on top of her. Elara could feel the furnace heat radiating from his massive body. She could feel his hot breath washing over her face, smelling of raw meat and copper. But the claws never tore into her flesh. The fangs never pierced her throat. The beast stopped. Elara kept her eyes squeezed shut, trembling so hard her teeth clicked together. She heard a strange sound, a deep, rapid sniffing. The beast's wet nose brushed against the skin of her neck, right over her pulse point. The feral growl died in his throat. It cut off so abruptly, it was as if someone had flipped a switch. Elara slowly, terrified, opened her eyes. The monster was inches from her face. His blood-red eyes were wide, the pupils blown completely black. He was staring at her neck, sniffing frantically, drawing her scent deep into his lungs. Inside the fractured, agonizing labyrinth of Thorn's mind, there was only pain. For 6 months, the blood-wrought curse had felt like liquid fire in his veins. It drowned his human consciousness in an ocean of blind, primal rage. He had been a prisoner inside his own skull, screaming while his beast tore at the chains. He knew his Beta Vane had poisoned him. He had seen Vane drop the dark magic powder into his wine 6 months ago, but the madness had taken him before he could speak. For half a year, Thorn had lived in hell. But then, the iron door had opened, and a fragile, terrified creature was thrown into his domain. His beast wanted to kill, wanted to tear. But as he lunged, a scent hit him. Rainwater, white lilies, and warm, sweet vanilla. It was like a bucket of ice water being dumped over a raging inferno. The moment the scent hit Thorn's senses, the blinding pain in his head shattered. The fog of the curse recoiled, screaming as it was burned away by something infinitely more powerful. Mate. The word echoed in the silence of his mind. Not a thought, but a fundamental truth etched into the very fabric of his soul. Mate. Mine. Safe. Protect. Thorn's human consciousness gasped, clawing its way back to the surface for the first time in 6 months. He looked at the girl cowering against the door. She was tiny, malnourished, dressed in the rags of a kitchen servant. She was crying silently, waiting for him to rip her apart. The beast inside him let out a pathetic, high-pitched whimper of pure distress. "We terrified her," the wolf cried. "Fix it. Comfort." Thorn's body shuddered violently. The shift overtook him, not the agonizing, uncontrolled ripping of the curse, but the fluid, natural shift of an alpha stepping down. Bone cracked and reformed. Fur receded into skin. Elara watched in absolute shock as the massive monster dissolved. In its place, kneeling on the cold stone floor, completely naked and breathing heavily, was a man. King Thorn. He was breathtakingly beautiful, even covered in the grime of the dungeon. Broad, scarred chest, sharp jawline, and thick dark hair that fell into his eyes. But his eyes weren't red anymore. They were a piercing, striking silver gray, and they were looking at her with a desperation that made her heart stop. "You," Thorn rasped. His voice was gravelly, destroyed from months of roaring, but it was human. You cleared the rot. You cleared my mind." Elara couldn't move. She couldn't breathe. The most dangerous alpha in the kingdom was kneeling before her, the heavy chains still bound to his wrists. Thorn reached out a hand. His fingers were shaking. He stopped inches from her face, his silver eyes pleading for permission. Elara didn't pull away. She was too stunned. When his rough, calloused fingertips brushed her cheek, the world exploded. A jolt of pure, golden electricity shot from his skin straight into her heart. The mate bond. It snapped into place with the force of a falling star, a connection so deep and so absolute that Elara's suppressed, silenced wolf threw its head back and howled in her mind. Thorn gasped, his eyes rolling back for a fraction of a second as he felt it too. He fell forward, his massive frame collapsing, but not to hurt her. He buried his face in the crook of her neck, inhaling her scent like a drowning man taking his first breath of air. "Mate," he whispered against her collarbone, his body trembling. "My mate. Thank the goddess. Thank you." Elara's hands, acting entirely on their own, lifted. Her small, raw fingers tangled in the king's dark hair. She held him. She was sitting on the floor of a dungeon, locked away to die, holding the mad king against her chest. And for the first time in her entire life, she felt completely, utterly safe. Chapter 4. They sat like that for a long time, Thorn holding on to her as if she were the only thing anchoring him to the earth, letting her scent continuously wash the remnants of the dark magic from his blood. Finally, he pulled back just enough to look into her eyes. His silver gaze traced every detail of her face. The bruises under her eyes, the hollows of her cheeks, the raw, bleeding skin on her knuckles from scrubbing floors. A new kind of fury ignited in his eyes, cold, calculated, lethal. "Who did this to you?" Thorn asked, his voice a low, terrifying rumble. "Who threw my queen into a dungeon?" Elara opened her mouth. She wanted to tell him. She wanted to say, Vane, Greta, all of them. But her throat tightened. The invisible wall slammed down, choking the words before they could form. She shook her head, tears of frustration welling in her eyes, and pointed to her throat. She mouthed the word, "I can't." Thorn frowned, his brow furrowing. He reached up, gently tracing the line of her throat. "You can't speak?" he asked softly. Elara shook her head, looking away in shame. She waited for the rejection. She waited for the Alpha King to realize his fated mate was a broken, defective mute. Instead, Thorn's hands gently cupped her face, forcing her to look back at him. There was no pity in his eyes, only a fierce, protective fire. "It doesn't matter," he said, with absolute conviction. "You don't need a voice to command them. I will be your voice. And when the time comes, every wolf in this castle will fall to their knees before you." He closed his eyes, pressing his forehead against hers, and then a deep, resonant voice echoed, not in the room, but directly inside Elara's mind. "Can you hear me, little wolf?" Elara gasped, her eyes flying open. Thorn was looking at her, a small, reassuring smile on his lips. The mate bond. It was so strong, so pure, that they didn't need spoken words. He was projecting his thoughts directly into her mind. Yes, Elara thought back, projecting her inner voice tentatively. It sounded strange to her, strong, clear, unhindered by the trauma that locked her physical throat. I can hear you. Thorn's smile widened, lighting up his grimy face. Beautiful, he thought, the word wrapping around her mind like a warm blanket. Your voice is beautiful. He sat back, his expression turning deadly serious. Listen to me, Elara. We are in grave danger. If Vane finds out I am lucid, if he finds out my mate cured the blood rot, he will bring his loyalists down here and slaughter us both before I can regain my full strength. My wolf is exhausted. My body has been starved and chained for 6 months. Your scent clears my mind, but it cannot rebuild muscle and bone overnight. I will need weeks before I am strong enough to take on an entire pack. Elara nodded, fear spiking in her chest. What do we do? Thorn looked at the heavy iron door. We play his game, for now. He turned back to her, his silver eyes flashing with dark brilliance. Tomorrow morning, the guards will come down to clear my cell. They will expect to find your bones. Instead, they will find you cowering in the corner, and they will find me acting like the mindless beast Vane wants me to be. You want me to go back out there? Elara's mind trembled. With them? Thorn's jaw clenched. He reached out, taking her raw, battered hands in his large, warm ones. I hate it. It goes against every instinct in my body to let you walk back into the hands of those who hurt you. But it is the only way. You will be my eyes and ears in the light. And every night, when the castle sleeps, you will come back down here, to me. He leaned in, his lips brushing against her temple. You will bring me food. You will bring me information on Vane's guard rotations. And you will give me your scent so the curse cannot return. We will build my strength day by day, and I promise you, what food cannot restore quickly enough, your presence accelerates. The mate bond is ancient medicine, Elara. The healers who cursed me never accounted for that. And the proof of Vane's treason? Elara projected. Thorn's eyes darkened. Vane always kept his sins in writing. It was the one weakness of a vain man. He needed a record of his victories. His private study, bottom desk drawer, false panel I had built for him when he was still loyal, before I ever imagined he would use it against me. A small leather-bound ledger with a silver clasp. Everything will be in there. The poison he purchased, the council members he bribed, the lands he promised. Bring it to me when the time is right. Elara looked at the man before her. He wasn't a monster. He was a king who had been betrayed, looking at a servant who had been discarded. They were two broken things in the dark, fitting together perfectly to forge a weapon. She didn't feel like a victim anymore. As Thorn's power flowed into her through their joined hands, her inner wolf stood up, shaking off years of fear. I will do it, she promised in his mind. I will be your spy. Thorn kissed her hands, a gesture of absolute respect. And I will be your retribution. Chapter 5. The next morning, the sound of the heavy deadbolt sliding out of place echoed like a gunshot in the dark cell. Elara scrambled into the far corner of the room, pressing herself against the damp stone, shivering. She didn't have to act. She was genuinely terrified of what the guards would do. Across the cell, Thorn was on his hands and knees. The moment the door opened, he let out a blood-curdling, feral roar, thrashing against his chains. Saliva flew from his mouth, his eyes wide and burning red. His performance was terrifyingly perfect. 2 guards stepped inside, holding heavy, silver-tipped spears. They froze when they saw Elara huddled in the corner, completely unharmed. Goddess above, one of the guards whispered, his face pale. She's alive. The beast didn't touch her. Must not like the smell of Omega, the other grunted, though his eyes were wide with shock. Get her out of here before he breaks those chains. The first guard rushed forward, grabbing Elara by the arm and hauling her out of the cell. As she was dragged through the door, she looked back. Thorn was thrashing wildly, snapping his jaws at the guards. But for one fraction of a second, through the red, his silver eyes found hers through the chaos. Be safe, my Luna, his voice echoed softly in her mind, a stark contrast to the monster he was pretending to be. I am with you. Elara was dragged back up the spiraling stairs and thrown onto the floor of the kitchen. Greta, the head maid, dropped a stack of ceramic plates when she saw her. The woman looked as though she had seen a ghost. How, Greta stammered, stepping backward. How are you alive? Elara slowly pushed herself off the floor. Her body was bruised, her dress was filthy, and she was freezing. But for the first time in 14 years, since she was 7 years old, she didn't look down. She stood up straight. She looked Greta dead in the eyes. Through the mate bond, she felt a surge of Thorn's alpha aura wrap around her spine like an invisible shield of armor. Elara didn't flinch. She simply stared at the woman who had tried to murder her, her silence suddenly feeling less like a weakness and more like a loaded weapon. Greta swallowed hard, unnerved by the strange, unnatural confidence radiating from the mute servant. Get back to work, Greta snapped, her voice trembling slightly. Clean the eastern wing. Elara turned and walked to the supply closet. The game had begun. For the next 3 weeks, Elara lived a double life. By day, she was the invisible, voiceless Omega. She scrubbed floors, served wine, and kept her head down. But her eyes were always watching. She memorized the patrol routes of Vane's personal guards. She noted which council members visited Vane's study late at night, and more importantly, which ones left looking frightened rather than satisfied. She stole an extra loaf of bread here, a slab of cooked meat there, hiding them in the deep pockets of her apron. On the 4th night, she nearly got caught. She had been moving down the servants' corridor toward the kitchen stores when she heard Vane's voice around the corner, low and cold and very close. She pressed herself flat against the stone wall, her pulse pounding so loudly she was certain he would hear it. Double the guard on the dungeon, Vane was saying to someone she couldn't see. Something feels wrong. The beast has been too quiet these last 2 days. Elara stopped breathing entirely. She stood there in the dark, her back against the wall, for what felt like an hour, until Vane's footsteps faded and the corridor went silent again. Her hands were shaking so badly, she nearly dropped the bread she had tucked into her apron. That night, she told Thorn. He sat up straighter when he heard it, his jaw going hard. He is suspicious, Thorn projected. We move carefully. No more coming every night, make it every other, and vary the hour. If he stations more men on the stairs, use the eastern maintenance passage behind the laundry. There is a loose stone third from the bottom on the left wall. I had it left loose on purpose, years ago. I always liked knowing my own castle had secrets. Elara stared at him in the dark. You planned for everything, didn't you? Thorn smiled, and it was the first time she had seen something approaching real warmth in his face. I planned for treachery. I just didn't know which direction it would come from. He paused, looking down at her hands in his. His thumbs moved in slow circles over her knuckles. How are they treating you up there? The same, she admitted. Greta hasn't struck me again, but she watches me. Thorn's eyes darkened. He said nothing for a moment. Then, when this is over, I am going to make her scrub every floor in this castle with her bare hands. No rags, no bucket, just her palms against the stone. Despite everything, Elara almost laughed. It moved through her chest like something forgotten, a warm, startled flutter. She pressed her lips together, and Thorn watched her face with an intensity that made her look away. "You almost smiled," he said quietly. She shook her head. "You did." He reached up, tilting her chin back toward him. "I want to see it again. When all of this is over, I want to hear what your laugh sounds like." Elara felt her chest tighten with something she had no word for. She pulled his hands back to hers and changed the subject, projecting carefully. "You feel stronger." "Day by day," he confirmed. "Your scent does what food alone cannot. The mate bond burns the rot out at the root." He flexed one hand, watching the tendons move under the skin. "Another week and I will be at half strength. 2 more after that, and I can break these chains without them even hearing it." 3 weeks, Elara projected. "We have 3 weeks." Thorn nodded, his silver eyes steady. 3 weeks. Then we end this. And in those 3 weeks, in the stolen hours between midnight and dawn, sitting in the cold dark of a dungeon that was slowly beginning to feel like the safest place in the world, Elara learned that the Alpha King was afraid of very little, except losing her. And Thorn learned that the girl who had not spoken in 14 years had more to say than anyone in his entire court combined. "Vane is meeting with the Eastern Alphas tomorrow," Elara projected into his mind on the 19th night as she sat between his legs, her back resting against his broad chest while his large hands gently stroked her hair. "I saw the ledgers on his desk when I was cleaning. He's promising them our borderlands in exchange for their support to officially crown him king." Thorn's chest rumbled with a deep growl. "He is selling my kingdom to buy a stolen crown." His arms tightened around her waist. "He is running out of time. The full moon is in 2 days. The pack will hold the Luna ceremony in the Grand Hall. Vane intends to claim Lady Cassandra as his Luna to legitimize his rule." Elara looked up at him in the dark. "Is that when we strike?" Thorn looked down at her, his silver eyes shining with a predatory brilliance. He reached up, his thumb gently tracing her lower lip. "That is when the dead king returns," Thorn thought, his mental voice dripping with dark promise. "And he is bringing his queen with him." Chapter 6. The tension in the Ironclaw pack house was suffocating. It was the afternoon before the Luna ceremony, and the entire castle hummed with a frantic, nervous energy. Beta Vane was preparing to formally usurp the throne. He had invited every regional alpha, every noble, and every high-ranking warrior to witness him class Lady Cassandra as his Luna, effectively sealing his right to rule. Elara was in the corridor outside the great kitchens when she first heard it. Vane's voice, coming from behind a closed door, low, deliberate, cold in a way that was nothing like his usual performance of cruelty. She stopped, set down her bucket, pressed herself against the wall beside the doorframe. "The dungeon logs," Vane was saying. "Show me." A pause, a shuffle of parchment. 3 weeks, Vane said. 3 weeks since we threw that Omega in the cell, and the beast hasn't touched her. She goes down every morning, comes back up every morning, unmarked. Another silence. When he spoke again, his voice was almost gentle, which was far worse than when it was loud. "That is not how a feral animal behaves." Elara's blood went cold. She did not move. She did not breathe. "Double the guard on the lower catacombs," Vane continued, "and find me that Omega. I want to know where she sleeps, when she eats, where she goes between midnight and dawn. I want eyes on her every hour. If she is somehow communicating with him." The sentence stopped. Then, "Bring her to me tomorrow morning, before the ceremony." Elara picked up her bucket with both hands, steady, controlled,
every movement deliberate, and walked away before the door opened. She turned into the laundry passage, ducked behind the hanging linens, and let herself shake for exactly 30 seconds. Then she stopped. She had work to do. She needed to reach Thorn tonight, and she needed to get that ledger first.
Elara was in Vane's private study an hour before sundown. She wasn't supposed to be there. Her heart hammered against her ribs as she rifled through the heavy mahogany desk. Thorn had told her exactly what to look for: a small, leather-bound ledger with a silver clasp. The ledger that detailed Vane's treason, his black market purchases of the blood-rot poison, his bribes to the council. "Hurry," her wolf whined, pacing anxiously in her mind. Elara's fingers found the false bottom on the first try. She knew exactly where it was. Third drawer, press the left corner down. The panel released with a soft click. There it was, the ledger, cold and metallic clasped in her palm. She shoved it deep into the hidden pocket of her oversized servant's apron, just as the heavy oak door to the study swung open. "What are you doing in here?" Elara spun around. It wasn't Vane. It was Greta. The head maid stood in the doorway, her face twisted into an ugly mask of suspicion. Elara quickly grabbed a dust rag from her bucket, pretending to wipe the edge of the desk. She kept her eyes lowered, playing the part of the terrified, invisible Omega. But Greta wasn't buying it today. "I didn't assign you to this wing," Greta snarled, stepping into the room and closing the door behind her. "You've been acting strange ever since you survived the catacombs, sneaking around, looking people in the eye. I think you're stealing." Greta marched forward, raising her hand to strike Elara across the face. But the slap never landed. Elara's hand shot up, her raw, calloused fingers wrapping around Greta's wrist with a speed and strength that defied her small frame. Greta gasped, her eyes going wide with shock. Through the mate bond, Elara felt a surge of Thorn's dark, protective energy flood her veins. She didn't flinch. She didn't cower. She looked directly into Greta's eyes, her own gaze hard and cold as winter ice. For one terrifying second, Greta saw the reflection of an alpha's dominance in the eyes of a mute servant. Elara shoved the woman's arm away, picked up her bucket, and walked past her without making a sound. Greta stood frozen in the study, too stunned to even shout an insult as Elara disappeared down the hall. She had 4 hours before the ceremony began. She used every minute of them. Chapter 7. Midnight approached. The great hall was a sea of silk, velvet, and gold. The chandeliers blazed with hundreds of candles, casting a warm light over the treacherous court. Beta Vane stood at the front of the dais, dressed in the royal crimson robes that did not belong to him. Beside him stood Cassandra, smiling a perfect, hollow smile. Elara was stationed at the edge of the room, holding a silver pitcher of wine. Vane had specifically ordered her to serve the head table, a power play. He wanted the broken thing that survived the dungeon to witness his absolute victory. But Elara wasn't looking at Vane. Her eyes were fixed on the heavy double doors at the back of the hall. Down in the pitch-black catacombs, Thorn stood in the center of his cell. The feral madness was completely gone. His mind was sharp, lethal, and deadly calm. He could feel Elara's anxiety pulsing through the bond, tethering him to the surface. He could feel the exact moment the moon reached its peak in the sky. "It is time, my king," Elara's voice whispered in his mind, clear and beautiful. "They are beginning the ceremony." Thorn smiled in the dark. "I am coming, little wolf." He looked down at the thick silver chains binding his wrists to the floor. Vane thought these chains held him because he was a beast. Vane didn't understand that for the past 3 weeks, the only thing keeping Thorn in this cell was his own patience. Thorn closed his eyes. He didn't shift into a wolf. He didn't need to. He simply summoned the raw, unfiltered aura of the Alpha King. He gripped the chains in his massive hands, his biceps bulging, muscles cording like steel wire. He pulled. With a deafening crack that echoed through the empty tunnels, the iron bolts ripped straight out of the solid stone floor. The silver links shattered like cheap glass. Thorn rolled his shoulders, the broken chains dangling from his wrists like morbid jewelry. He kicked the heavy iron door of the cell so hard the hinges buckled, and the door crashed into the corridor outside. The two guards stationed outside spun around, raising their spears, their faces draining of color. "The beast!" one screamed. Thorn stepped into the torchlight. He was covered in dirt, wearing only ragged trousers, his chest bare and scarred. But his silver-gray eyes were perfectly sane, and his posture was that of a conqueror. "Drop your weapons," Thorn commanded. The alpha tone rolled off him in a suffocating wave of power, dropping the two guards straight to their knees. Their spears clattered to the stone. They pressed their foreheads to the floor, whining in absolute submission. Thorn didn't even look at them as he walked past, ascending the spiral stairs toward the light. He had a kingdom to reclaim, and a mate to crown. Chapter 8. In the great hall, Elder Morlin raised his hands, silencing the crowd. "We gather under the light of the full moon," the elder proclaimed, "to witness the claiming of Luna Cassandra and to officially recognize Beta Vane as the new alpha of the Ironclaw Pack, as our former king is lost to the madness." Vane puffed out his chest, looking out over the crowd with a smug, victorious grin. He reached for Cassandra's hand, pulling her close, leaning in to bare his fangs to mark her neck. Boom! The sound was like a cannon going off. The massive 20-foot-tall oak doors at the back of the hall didn't just open, they exploded inward. Shards of ancient wood rained down on the polished marble. The music ceased instantly. Screams erupted from the nobles near the back. Through the dust and splintered wood, a silhouette emerged. He walked with the slow, terrifying, measured steps of a predator who has already locked the exits. The crowd parted violently, wolves scrambling over each other to get out of his path. As he stepped into the light of the chandeliers, the entire hall collectively stopped breathing. King Thorn. He looked demonic. The broken chains still hung from his wrists, clinking against the marble with every step. His bare chest was smeared with the grime of the dungeon, his dark hair wild. But he wasn't growling. He wasn't crawling. He was walking on 2 feet, and his silver eyes were locked dead onto Vane. Vane stumbled backward, nearly tripping over the dais steps. His face went the color of ash. "Guards!" Vane shrieked, his voice cracking with pure terror. "Guards, kill it! The beast has escaped! Kill him!" A dozen elite warriors rushed forward, drawing their silver swords, moving to intercept Thorn. Thorn didn't break his stride. He didn't even raise his hands. He simply let his aura free. It hit the room like a physical shock wave, the sheer, crushing gravity of a true, pure-blooded alpha king. The advancing warriors hit an invisible wall, their knees buckled. One by one, their swords fell from their hands, and they collapsed to the floor, forced into submission by the blood command they could not disobey. Every wolf in the room dropped. Nobles, elders, servants. The pressure forced them to their knees, bowing before the true king. Only 2 people remained standing. Vane, who was paralyzed by fear on the dais, and Elara, standing quietly by the pillar, the silver pitcher still in her hands, completely unaffected by the king's crushing aura. Because an alpha's command does not force his true mate to bow. Thorn reached the base of the dais. He looked up at Vane, his expression a mask of lethal calm. "You're sitting in my chair, Vane," Thorn said softly. The sound of his sane, articulate voice sent a fresh wave of horror through the regent. You're mad," Vane stammered, backing away until his back hit the throne. "The rot, the poison." "Ah," Thorn tilted his head. So you admit it was poison. Thorn took one step up the dais. Vane panicked. He shifted mid-stride, his body tearing into a large brown wolf, lunging desperately for Thorn's throat. It was over before the crowd could even blink. Thorn didn't shift. He simply reached out with one massive hand and caught Vane's wolf by the throat in midair. The momentum of the beast was stopped dead. Thorn slammed the brown wolf down onto the marble table, shattering it completely. He pinned the whimpering Beta by the neck, his silver eyes flashing with golden fire. "You poisoned my wine," Thorn growled, his voice vibrating through the hall. "You chained me in the dark like an animal. You tried to steal my kingdom. But do you know what your greatest mistake was, Vane?" Vane whined, struggling uselessly against the king's iron grip. Thorn looked across the room. The lethal coldness in his eyes melted into something violently possessive as his gaze locked onto the small, quiet servant girl standing by the far pillar. "She was not just an Omega you threw away to die." His voice dropped, each word falling like a stone into still water. "She was my mate." The collective gasp from the pack was louder than the shattering of the table. Every head that could lift under the alpha aura turned to look where the king was looking. At the mute servant girl with the silver pitcher, the girl who scrubbed their floors and wore rags. They had all seen Vane send her to the dungeon, every single one of them. But this they had not known. The moon goddess had chosen her. The fated mate of the Alpha King had been living among them as a kitchen servant, and they had let her bleed on their floors. The shame that moved through the room was thick enough to taste. Chapter 9. Thorn released Vane, tossing him to the floor like a piece of garbage. "Bind him," Thorn ordered the guards, who immediately scrambled to obey their true king. Thorn turned his back on the traitor. He didn't care about the gasping nobles, or the weeping Lady Cassandra, or the stunned elders. He walked across the ruined hall, straight toward Elara. As he approached, Greta, who was kneeling just a few feet away, realized what was happening. The woman who had kicked dirty water on Elara, who had mocked her, who had sent her to the catacombs to be eaten, began to hyperventilate. She pressed her face into the floor, shaking uncontrollably. Thorn stopped in front of Elara. She looked up at him. He was a terrifying sight to anyone else. Grime-covered, chained, wild-haired, radiating enough power to bring an entire court to its knees. But to her, he was just the man who had held her hands in the dark and asked her what her laugh sounded like. Thorn reached out. He didn't care that his hands were dirty or that her dress was rough-spun wool. He gently took the silver pitcher from her hands and let it drop to the floor. The sound it made hitting the marble rang out across the silent hall. Then, before the entire kingdom, the Alpha King dropped to one knee. He took Elara's raw, scarred hands in his. He pressed his lips to her knuckles, not quickly, not as a gesture, but slowly, deliberately, kissing every bruise she had earned scrubbing his floors. "My queen," he said, his voice carrying clearly in the dead silent room. "I told you I would be your voice. I told you they would bow." He stood, pulling her up with him, and turned to face the court. He kept her hand locked tightly in his, pulling her flush against his side. "For 6 months you allowed a traitor to rule you," Thorn's voice boomed, sharp and unrelenting. "For years you allowed this woman, my fated mate, chosen by the goddess herself, to be treated worse than the dirt on your boots." He reached into Elara's apron pocket and pulled out the leather-bound ledger. He threw it at the feet of Elder Morlin. "Here is the proof of Vane's treason, the poison he bought, the lands he planned to sell. He is stripped of his wolf. He is stripped of his title. He will rot in the very cell he built for me." Vane screamed as the guards dragged him away, but his cries were ignored. "And as for the rest of you,"
Thorn's eyes narrowed, scanning the servants, stopping dead on Greta. The head maid sobbed openly against the marble. Anyone who raised a hand to my Luna, anyone who spoke an unkind word to her, you will answer to her now. Thorn looked down at Elara. His silver eyes were soft, full of an unconditional love that made her chest ache. It's time, my love, he whispered in her mind. Let them hear you. Elara closed her eyes. For 14 years, since she was 7 years old, she had lived in silence, not by choice, by force. The trauma had built itself into the architecture of her body, brick by brick, until speaking had become as impossible as breathing underwater. She had stopped trying. She had stopped hoping. She had learned to make herself small instead. Small enough to be invisible, small enough to survive. But as Thorn's arm wrapped around her waist, as the warmth of the mate bond poured through her like sunlight through a crack in stone, she felt something begin to give way. Not break, give way. The way ice gives way in spring, slowly, inevitably, from the inside out. She was not that 7-year-old girl on the floor anymore. She was the woman who had carried food through the dark to a caged king. She was the spy who had memorized guard rotations and stolen a ledger from under the nose of the man who ordered her death. She was the one who had stood at the edge of this hall tonight, alone and afraid, and held her ground. She opened her mouth. The room was so quiet she could hear the candles burning.
Her throat clicked, tight, painful, the muscles seizing exactly the way they always did. Thorn went completely still beside her. He didn't speak. He didn't push. He simply held her hand and waited with the patience of a man who had spent 6 months in the dark and understood what it meant to wait for the light. Elara looked directly at Greta, who was on her knees, pressed to the marble, shaking. She took one breath, then another. The sound came out like something broken open and raw, barely more than air moving over unused machinery. But it was her voice, her actual voice, not the one inside her mind, the one that lived in her throat and had been silent since she was a child. Not a single person in the great hall moved. Elara felt the mate bond surge. A wave of pure, steady warmth flowed from Thorn into her chest, not forcing her, not pushing, just present, just there, like a hand held out in the dark. She lifted her chin. She straightened her spine. She let herself be seen, truly seen, for the first time in her life. And when she spoke again, her advice did not tremble. She scrubs the floors. The words fell like the strike of a gavel. No one breathed. No one moved. The entire court of the Iron Claw pack, nobles and elders and warriors who had bowed to kings, stared at the Omega servant who had just found her voice and felt something shift permanently in the room. Thorn let out a low dark that vibrated through the hall. It was the sound of a man who had made a promise in the dark and watched it come true in the light. "You heard your queen," Thorn said, his eyes flashing with lethal amusement. "Greta is stripped of her rank. She will clean the lowest levels of the pack house, without magic, without help, until her hands bleed exactly as my Luna's did." Greta, collapsing completely as 2 guards hauled her to her feet and dragged her toward the servants' corridors. The court was terrified, unsure of what the king would do next. But Thorn's wrath had been spent. He turned his full attention back to Elara. He didn't care about the audience anymore. He reached up, gently pushing her dark hair over her shoulder, exposing the crook of her neck. The skin there was unblemished, waiting. "I have waited my entire life for you," Thorn, his voice thick with emotion,
ignoring the hundreds of eyes watching them. "I would have spent 1,000 years in the dark if it meant finding you in the end." Elara's eyes filled with tears, but this time they were tears of absolute joy. "And I would bring you the light every time," she back, her voice growing stronger with every word she spoke. "Do you accept me, Elara?" Thorn asked, his thumb brushing her cheek. "As your mate? As your alpha?" "I do," she said without a single ounce of hesitation. "I accept you." Thorn's eyes flared molten gold. His wolf rose to the surface, not in feral madness, but in pure, reverent devotion. He leaned down, his lips brushing against her pulse point, she arching her neck to give him better access. When his fangs sank into her skin, there was no pain. There was only a blinding, white-hot rush of completeness. The claiming mark sealed the bond, locking their souls together in a tether that could never be broken. The energy of it exploded outward, a wave of golden light that washed over the great hall, warm and healing, a stark contrast to the crushing dominance he had displayed moments before. The pack felt it, the absolute purity of the bond, the indisputable truth that the moon goddess had chosen this pairing. When Thorn pulled back, he licked the wound closed, leaving a permanent crescent-shaped scar on her neck. He rested his forehead against hers, both of them breathing heavily, completely lost in each other. "My queen," he said. "My king," she answered. Slowly, starting with Elder Morlin and followed by every noble, warrior, and servant in the room, the pack lowered their heads. They didn't bow out of fear of the Alpha's aura this time. They bowed out of respect. They bowed to the king who had conquered madness and the voiceless girl who had saved him. 1 year later, the dungeons beneath the Ironclaw Castle had been sealed completely. Elara stood on the grand balcony of the royal wing, looking out over the sprawling forests of her kingdom. She wore a dress of deep sapphire silk, a silver crown resting perfectly in her dark hair. Her hands were soft now, the scars faded to pale silver lines across her knuckles. She never hid them.
They were proof of what she had survived, and she had decided that proof was worth showing. She heard the heavy, familiar footsteps approach from behind. Strong arms wrapped around her waist, and Thorn buried his face in her neck, right over his claiming mark. "You're working too hard," he murmured, his voice vibrating against her skin. "The council can wait until tomorrow." Elara leaned back against his solid chest, smiling. "I was just reviewing the new servant protection laws. I want to make sure they are flawless before I sign them." "They are flawless because you wrote them," he said, kissing the tip of her nose. "My brilliant, fierce Luna." She laughed, a bright, clear sound that still surprised her sometimes, the way it came out so easily now, as though it had always been there, just waiting for a safe enough place to land. "There is something else," she said. She turned in his arms to face him, and something in her expression made him go still. Thorn looked healthy and vibrant, the dark shadows of the curse completely erased from his silver eyes. He had told her once, in the dark of the dungeon, that he still slept better with his face buried in her neck, that 6 months in the catacombs had left something behind that only her scent could quiet. She had never asked him to change that. She had learned that some wounds healed on the outside first. "I've been teaching them," Elara said. Thorn tilted his head. "The Omega children, the ones in the lower servants' quarters." She looked at her hands, the scarred ones, the ones that remembered every floor they had scrubbed. "I've been teaching them to read, every morning before the rest of the house wakes up. Just an hour, just the basics." She looked back up at him. "No one taught me. I want them to know that someone thought they were worth teaching." Thorn was quiet for a moment, the kind of quiet that had weight in it. Then he pulled her in and held her, not with the desperate grip of the dungeon, not with the ferocity of the Great Hall, but with something steadier. The way you hold something you are no longer afraid of losing because you have finally accepted that it is real. "We built this together," she said softly into his chest. "No," Thorn corrected, his voice rough at the edges in a way that had nothing to do with anger. "You built me back together. The kingdom was just a bonus." And as they stood on the balcony, bathed in the light of a peaceful moon, Elara knew that the silence of her past was gone forever. Her voice was the loudest in the kingdom, and the monster in the dark was simply the man who loved her more than life itself, and who still, every single night, slept a little better when he could smell her beside him. And that brings us to the end of King Thorn and Elara's story. Wow. From scrubbing floors in silence to teaching the next generation and writing the laws of the kingdom, Elara is the definition of a survivor. Thank you so much for staying with me until the very end of this journey. I love sharing these stories with you all. Now, I want to hear from you. What was the most satisfying moment of the story for you? Was it Thorn breaking his own chains, Elara catching Greta's wrist, or those 4 words, "She scrubs the floors"? Drop your answer in the comments below, and while you're at it, tell me where in the world you are listening from and what time it is for you right now. I'm currently recording this late at night, and knowing you guys are listening from all over the globe makes it so worth it. If you loved this video, please smash that like button, subscribe to the Alpha Claim, and share this with someone who loves a good revenge romance. I already have another incredible story lined up for next week, and you will not want to miss it.